Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom with our host, Bob Olson, who will now introduce today's show and speaker.
WCAT Radio presents Rivers of Living Water, a program offered by Mary Schwartz about how to grow in holiness and have a more intimate relationship with God. Jesus said in John chapter 7, "If anyone thirst, let him come to me and drink, and out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." Now here's our hostess, Mary Schwartz. Hi, Mary.
Hello. One of the ways Jesus fulfills his promise to give us living water is through the gift of contemplative prayer. The Church says contemplative prayer is not just for the great saints, but it's a gift God wants to give to all of us. We'll be talking about the virtues we need to grow in and how to pray so that we have a more intimate relationship with God and obtain this gift of contemplative prayer, this living water, which transforms us more and more into the likeness of Christ. Our guest today is Dr. Robert Enright, a Catholic psychologist who has pioneered the scientific study of forgiveness. He has been called the Forgiveness Trailblazer by Time magazine because of his research and programs for helping people forgive, including the worst kinds of injustices and wounds. Dr. Enright is the author of 7 books, a professor at the University of Wisconsin, and the co-founder of the International Forgiveness Institute, which runs forgiveness education programs for children in schools in war, torn, and impoverished areas all over the world. Dr. Enright's program for children in Belfast has been operating for 14 years and is now spreading across Northern Ireland. And his programs in Galilee and Greece are also rather extensive, but they, as I say, they have programs all over the world. The former president of the American Psychological Association says that Dr. Enright's book, 8 Keys to Forgiveness, quote, has the potential to enrich and improve more lives than any psychology book in decades. Don't give up on forgiveness in your life until you read this book and try its proven strategies. So, Dr. Enright, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mary. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on. Doctor, how did you become interested in helping people forgive?
Well, I was hired at the University of Wisconsin to do moral development research. And most of that's centered on how children and adolescents think about fairness or justice. And after I got tenure, I became really bored with the idea of my own field that was very good to me. So I was looking for something in the field of moral development or virtues or values that would actually be of use to every human being on the planet. So I asked that question, what in the realm of morals would be something everyone has to confront? And I realized that we've all been treated unfairly by others, and we need a response to that, and the moral response to that in many cases could be forgiveness. So I thought maybe this could be a healing strategy for people, but there had never been research on the topic of forgiveness. So when I started looking at that research, we were doing it for the first time at the University of Wisconsin, I was delightedly surprised at how powerful it is. And with your intro, Mary, with those are the Bible readers, we shouldn't have been surprised by that because Jesus told us that to forgive is important. But we showed scientifically that, in fact, good things happen when people forgive.
And so tell us, what does the scientific evidence show about the effects of forgiveness?
Well, we actually went to many, many people and asked them how they forgave others. And we developed a model of forgiving, which I'm sure we'll be going through in the program. But when we put people through this model by randomizing them either to forgiveness therapy or something else, and you have to give that some time, a matter of months usually, we find that people reduce in anger, they can reduce in depression and anxiety, they can increase in their hope toward the future, knowing they're strong enough to face adversity, and they end up liking themselves. Because one thing I have found, when people have been abused by others, unfortunately they end up not liking themselves. And as they give the gift of forgiveness to others, paradoxically, good things happen to them, including basically loving themselves again.
Yes, I noticed that in your book, that was an important effect of being treated badly, that you somehow or other blame yourself.
Too often that happens. I wish the world did not work that way, but it does. We end up almost cooperating with the big lie when people tell a person they're worthless, they're no good, and that's the big lie. Eventually people too often start thinking that way, and forgiveness, that's why I say it can give the person their life back as they give goodness to those who have not been good to them. They can stand strong and say what happened to me was wrong, it's not my fault, and move forward.
Yes, you said in one of your books that forgiveness can save your life.
Yeah.
And there's some stunning evidence. You showed that in a study involving incest survivors,
yes,
the women were freed from depression.
Yes, that was with Suzanne Friedman, a professor at the University of Northern Iowa, and the results that I'll talk about right now were so powerful that was part of the reason why I said in the book, The 8 Keys to Forgiveness, forgiveness can save your life. Because we worked with 12 incest survivors. All of them came to us with that low self-esteem, a low sense of hopefulness toward their future, and they were all clinically depressed. And Suzanne courageously worked with each woman one-on-one, once a week for, on the average, 14 months. And at the end of that time, the first 6 who were part of the forgiveness therapy went from clinically depressed to non-depressed. It's not that they just improved in depression, but the depression left. Then we worked with the next 6, and their depression left. And then we waited over a year after the first group was finished with forgiveness therapy, and after a year of no therapy, they were still non-depressed. So they were basically cured of their psychological depression. But what's interesting is not one of them at the beginning wanted to forgive the perpetrator. All of them said, and they said this independently, which is interesting. I don't know if I should be part of your study. I might not give you good results because there's no way I'm going to forgive this guy. But over time, with Suzanne's gentle approach, and it's always up to the client whether he or she wants to forgive. That can never or should never be forced on anybody. But they all willingly made that choice. They did the work of forgiving, which is hard work, but I think it's a lot easier than living with the pain of depression for the rest of one's life. And they were basically emotionally healed.
Yes, which is fantastic. So you talk in your books about some of the effects of being treated unjustly or unfairly or abused. It can cause depression, anxiety. You mentioned a kind of an intense anger.
Yes. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about those side effects?
Yeah. Here's what we seem to see as a sequence. First, a person has been treated very unjustly, and it could be one event, or it could be smaller events that are 100 times, where a person is just living with this day in and day out. So the injustice happens first. Then comes emotional pain, and that can take the form of sadness or confusion or frustration. And then as a person lives with that pain without a way out, that pain starts to become a part of them. And people start then resenting that they have pain. And when it doesn't go away, that's when they start moving into a deep anger, what I call unhealthy anger. It doesn't start as anger oftentimes. It oftentimes starts as more of a sadness or a confusion. But once we get to this unhealthy anger, and by that I mean the person seems to be dominated by it. It becomes part of their identity. It becomes part of who they are. That then can lead to more psychological compromise, like depression, like anxiety. And the reason forgiveness therapy is so important is this. If someone has depression and they go to a helping professional, the helping professional likely is going to treat the depression itself, perhaps with medication or perhaps with therapy, but that's about the fourth iteration of the problem. The first problem was the injustice. The second was the pain. The third was the intense anger, and then came the depression. And unless we look back at the anger causing the depression and the injustice ultimately being what has caused all the rest of this, then we're not going to give the right medicine. And the right medicine in this case would be forgiveness. I'm not talking about a pill here. I'm talking about the psychological, spiritual medicine, if you will, of forgiving another. But many in the helping professions don't go that deeply. And if someone comes in with depression or anxiety, we stay on that level.
I think that is so interesting, Doctor, and gives so many people reason for hope.
Indeed.
You know, when I used to teach in the RCIA, and one of the most burning questions I would encounter, frequently, in a part of people preparing for baptism or confirmation, was how were they going to live up to Jesus' demanding teaching on forgiveness?
Oh.
Was he really asking that? And if so, how on earth were they going to do it?
Yep.
Well,
here's why I think that's such a great question. The Bible is to show us the pathway to salvation. It is not meant to be a psychological how-to manual. It tells us the importance of forgiveness. It shows the importance of forgiveness. And Jesus demonstrated that on the cross. But the job of the Bible isn't to open to a certain page and then go through the exercises of forgiving.
Unfortunately.
Well, but it's okay. Because, if it wasn't for all of that pointing me to the direction of forgiveness, maybe I wouldn't have gone to it as a psychologist. So now we're working as a team here, you see. We have the spiritual direction, we have the call to it, but now we need a profession that's job is to find the pathway. And that's really what my life's calling has been, to find the pathway of forgiving and then to find the effects of that. And you and I have been talking about the effects of the pathway, but it's finding the pathway that I think is psychology's contribution to Jesus' call to forgive.
The pathway to forgive, how to do it.
The how-to, exactly.
Yeah, or at least how to make it easier. Yeah.
How to get to
facilitate
the
it. Yeah.
That's right. How to facilitate it and make it bearable as you heal. I call it rehabilitation of the heart. So the forgiveness pathway is rehab of the heart.
Okay, Doctor. So you said that you started by actually talking to people who have been able to forgive and learning from their experience. That's
right. And here's what we tend to have found, and then we have built this model, and this is the model we actually bring that Suzanne Friedman brought to the incest survivors, where she got such dramatic results. First, people have to admit they've been treated unfairly. And sometimes that's hard to do. Let's say it's a parent, okay? We've recently done some studies in China with the cultural theme of what they call filial piety, or honoring the parent. And it's hard sometimes for people to say, my parent has done wrong. But sometimes parents fail, and they fail hard. So the first step is to say, I have been treated unjustly. Next, we examine the effects of that injustice. And that starts with that pain we're talking about. Then people tell us that eventually they start developing symptoms like fatigue, which is a sign that something's wrong.
Wow.
And then they start to have dreams oftentimes of the person, or they ruminate on the person, and they ruminate on what happened, where there's like a lack of inner peace because they're replaying the tape, if you will, of what happened. See, that's a way of a person trying to solve the problem without knowing how. And then what we see eventually is the effects of unhealthy anger without necessarily even admitting it as unhealthy anger. There may be sleeplessness, there may be irritability, there may be taking anger out on others. See, one of the signs that one is very angry is annoyance with others, or throwing their own pain onto others in an angry way. And when people see that, they realize, oh, this anger has a hold of me. And so they realize that one injustice has led to layers of pain, the initial confusion, and then this fatigue, and then ruminating on the other, and then the issue that, I am really, really in pain here, and I'm really angry, and I have to do something about it. So all of that is about uncovering the effects of injustice. And as you can see, it can get rather complicated.
Yes.
And
then if you're dealing with a Christian, you may have somebody who's trying not to feel anger.
Right. And see,
pushing it down and isn't even, out of the best of motives.
That's right.
Doesn't even know how angry they are.
Right. And see, St. Paul told us to be angry but sin not. And then he says, don't let the sun go down on your anger. So people read that and say, oh, my goodness, I have to have it all wrapped up before I go to bed by tonight. but see, when you look at the actual scripture there, when he says, don't let the sun go down on your anger, the Greek word for anger there is par orgismos. And par, the prefix, is very important there, because par intensifies the word orgismos. So what we're talking about is not just regular anger, but he's talking about frothing, plotting, revengeful anger.
That's so important.
Very important. So, Paul and the Bible have never told us not to get angry. He tells us to be angry but sin not. What he's saying is, if you think you want to kill the guy, work on that, okay, and work on that swiftly. But he's not telling you not to own anger. So that's why Christians need kind of a re-education on that point of anger. It's a natural emotion. God gave us anger. But what we don't want to do is have it be intemperate, as Thomas Aquinas would tell us. We don't want that anger to get so deep and so much a part of us that we get all these symptoms and we're making ourselves and others miserable. So to continue with this idea of the path, once people begin realizing that something is really wrong internally, they make decisions. What am I going to do about this? And forgiveness can be one of the decisions and a choice. I have a book deliberately entitled Forgiveness is a Choice, because we shouldn't drag people into it. If it's a grim obligation, we've kind of, shall we say, lost the game. I think people should be drawn to forgiveness as something beautiful and not say, I've got to do it, it's a grim obligation, I have to eat my spinach and I won't get dessert unless I eat my spinach. But forgiveness, we have to see it for what it is. So at the decision phase, which is the next part of the journey, we have people explore the definition of forgiveness. What is it they're doing when they're forgiving? Well, the most simple definition is you're good to those who aren't good to you. Then people get scared, and we have to say, here's what we're not saying. We're not saying you're caving into the injustice and will let the person who's unfair to you have their way. You're not excusing the person and say, well, what they did was all right. It wasn't really that bad. you are not necessarily reconciling with the other. See, if someone is terribly abusive, you can get out of there and not reconcile unless that person shows they have repented, they have remorse, they will change. And then people also have to realize that justice and forgiveness exist side by side. When you forgive, you don't give up the quest for justice. And some people are really concerned about that because they say, well, if I forgive, then I have to not ask them to pay the car bill if they've damaged my car. No. When you forgive, you seek justice. So when a person understands what forgiveness is, that they're being good to the other without caving in and letting them have their way or letting the injustice reign, then they will say yes. And so the first working on forgiveness is answer to this question. Are you willing to do no harm to the one who hurt you? See, we're not asking at the beginning for the person who's forgiving to love the other. We're saying refrain from the negative. Can you make a commitment today, as you hear my voice saying this, to not seek revenge, to not say negative things, to not deliberately hurt the person if you had a chance to do so? People resonate to that. They can more easily do that. Then they get a little stronger, and so we do thinking work. We start with thinking. That's one of the chapters in the 8 Keys to Forgiveness. And so we ask people to begin thinking about the one who hurt them in new ways. Here are some questions we ask in therapy.
The one who hurt them in what ways, Doctor?
Well, when we now ask questions to the client about the one who hurt them. Okay? And so now if you're my client, you're going to be thinking about the one who hurt you, who was unfair to you, with these questions. Do you know anything about the person's past where they have been wounded by others, and so they're a wounded person wounding you? So that's more of a situational perspective. And then we ask more of the humanity perspective. What do you share in common with this person who hurt you? You probably share woundedness. You've both been treated unfairly. Maybe the other by someone else, not you, but you both have been wounded. You both will die someday. Okay? You both have air to breathe. Okay? When people hit you, you're going to be hurt. You share a common humanity, and all humanity is special, unique, and irreplaceable. And so we ask the question, does the person who hurt you have worth, inherent built-in worth, because they're a human being, not because of what they've done, but in spite of it? And that's a hard question to answer, and that takes time for someone to say, they do have worth. Then we get to, if we're dealing Catholic to Catholic, then we ask the toughest questions. Okay, here are the Catholic questions. Are you made in the image and likeness of God? Is the other made in the image and likeness of God? Okay. Did Jesus Christ die for you? Did Jesus Christ die for the other person? Is it possible that Jesus had to die on the cross for what that person did to you? And then we ask a deep Catholic question. It's an imagery question that goes something like this. Let's go to Calvary now. Let's go to Mount Calvary, and let us be witnessing the crucifixion. And I want you as my client to picture yourself at the foot of the cross, and I want you to now gently bring in the one who has hurt you. And you are standing side by side with Jesus dying for both of you. What does that do to your heart regarding the one who hurt you? That's the beginning of what we call compassion. And it's not a thinking question anymore. It's a feeling question. And that's when a person is beginning to shift from the anger, the frustration, the annoyance, or even the hatred to a softer heart. Because they're seeing that they are sharing a humanity, and they are sharing in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ for each of them. And compassion is suffering along with the other. And once a person starts softening their heart, we move from the question, to do no harm, are you willing to commit to do no harm, to a more positive question. Are you willing to bear the pain of what that person did to you by standing up with that pain, with Jesus Christ, for the one who has hurt you? Are you willing to bear pain as Jesus has borne even for you? And are you willing to bear that pain with Jesus Christ for the other? That's very deep. It usually happens in a mature response of forgiveness. And St. John Paul II, in his apostolic letter, Salvifici Doloris, refers to this as redemptive suffering for the other, okay? Where you are now not only being good to the person who has not been good to you, you not only are doing no harm to the one who hurt you, you now have the opportunity through your pain to redemptively suffer for that person, where grace could be shown on that person because of your pain and because of your willingness to stand in the pain with Jesus Christ. And this standing in the pain becomes transformational, where a person realizes they're stronger than the pain. They're able to take the pain, and the pain will not defeat them. And that's when they begin to start liking themselves. They might have a stronger relationship with Jesus, and they might then be able to offer prayers. They might be able to offer sacrifices for then their pain as a sacrifice for the one who hurt them. And that's a gift. You see, it's giving a gift. And forgiveness is gift-giving in its highest level. And the highest gift you can ever give to another human being who has hurt you is to suffer with Jesus for them. And that's what forgiveness offers.
You are uniting your suffering that they've caused you with Christ's sufferings.
That's right.
For their salvation.
For their salvation and for their well-being even on earth, which is the highest gift you could ever give to anyone. So then we ask the question of the client, who are you as a person if you can do that? Who are you? Are you worthless? Are you someone who has no worth at all, even though you've been believing that? Who are you to even be able to do that? And the answer always is, I'm better than I thought I was. I'm stronger than I thought I was. And now people find meaning in their suffering. You see, St. John Paul II in Salvifici Doloris says, when we can redemptively suffer for others, that transforms the meaning of what suffering is. It exalts suffering to a much higher level than we ever thought possible. So that now we realize that suffering is a vehicle for me to help shed Jesus Christ's grace on the other, for me to draw closer to Jesus Christ, and for me to be healed. And so there's a new meaning in suffering, and it's there people begin to have a new purpose in life.
But to get to that point, Doctor, to get to that point where you're willing to suffer redemptively for somebody who's hurt you, do you first have to go through, for instance, in the 8 Keys to Forgiveness, you talk about visualizing the person in different stages of life, as an infant, as a child. I mean, that's the redemptive suffering. Accepting redemptive suffering is a fairly advanced stage in this process, right?
That's why I mentioned it near the end of the process, because you see, the first set of questions are the cognitive questions. Well, how was the other person hurt? And so you can go to their childhood, go to their adolescence, go to their adulthood, and see the wounds they have suffered. And that can take months to examine that.
You can spend months on that stage.
You can spend months on that. Yeah.
And sort of developing empathy for the person who hurt you.
Then you go to the common humanity between you, and that can take months. And then eventually, and only if the person's ready, but you're not going to talk to someone who's not Catholic about that point.
No, obviously.
See,
I just don't want people to get discouraged and think, I can't get to that part,
Right. Well, see, and they shouldn't be expected to get to that part today. But see, what Thomas Aquinas would tell us, who was really a disciple, the disciple's not the right word. He was taught by Aristotle thousands of years before him, of course. And Aristotle tells us, look to the end point. Look to where you're heading on anything important. So when we look at forgiveness and we ask, what is the end point of forgiving? Now this is going to, remember, we're on a path and it takes a long time. The end point of forgiving for a Catholic is this: to unite with Jesus Christ in your pain with his pain for the one who hurt you. That's where you're heading as a Catholic when you forgive. But to say, I'm going to go to that end point today, or if I don't get there, forget it, that's missing the point of the end point. To put it in a secular context, if you take a 10-year-old and say, I want you to, let's say he's a basketball player, I want you to hit 20 free throws in a row. Well, they might walk off terribly discouraged because they can only hit 1 out of 20. But we have a goal, and the goal is 20. And it might take them 2 years to be able to hit 20, but they have the goal in mind. Without the goal, they'll never get there. So we need to know that goal, but we also have to be gentle with ourselves and humble, knowing we have to take this a step at a time.
Right. So that step, I don't know what you call it in your book, Forgiveness is a Choice, but that step where you look at, you imagine a person at the different stages of his life as an infant or a child, and you think of, as an adolescent, and you think about how they might have been hurt or shaped by their experience.
Right.
If you do that with a therapist, you could do that for a long time. Is that right?
You could do that for months, actually, because it takes a while to enter into the other person's world. See, when you do that, it's painful, and so you might have to take breaks and be gentle with yourself and do it a little bit at a time. You don't want to force the process, and that's the beginning of what we call the work phase of forgiveness, where we start doing the work. And we always start with the thinking exercises like that, because it's easier to think about the other than to feel empathy or compassion for them.
Yes. And now I gather from that some of your books are designed to help people go through this process without a therapist, in case they can't afford it or can't find somebody.
Right.
And that would be your book, Forgiveness is a Choice, and the 8 Keys to Forgiveness, both of those books.
And then also my deepest one for people who want to do this themselves is called The Forgiving Life. And that's also the American Psychological Association. But your listeners should keep in mind that the Catholic version I just went through with the redemptive suffering, that's not in any of those books, because these books are written for psychological publishers. So I want to respect their view of what they're trying to publish. And so I can't go to the absolute deepest endpoint of what forgiveness is in those books. So we go through looking at the woundedness of the other through their different stages of childhood and adolescence. We get to the common humanity. And then we do ask people, using their own spiritual tradition, to ask who the other is relative to that tradition. So we're going to get different answers on the deepest level, because spiritualities lead us to more or less different conclusions.
Now, maybe at this point, and then are there more steps in your
That's basically about it. The last step is, once you walk this pathway, you begin to experience emotional relief. That's the paradox of forgiveness. You see, if you think about the pathway we just outlined, Mary, much of it is about giving to the other. Do no harm, seeing the other in their woundedness, seeing the other in their humanity, trying to give a gift to them, bearing pain for them. But the paradox is, as I keep giving to the other, it's not that I am just draining myself. You actually become enriched. And even in a psychological sense, where the anxiety begins to lessen, the anger begins to lessen, as you and I have talked about the incest survivor study. The depression begins to lessen, and you begin to like yourself. So there's a lot of emotional healing awaiting those who walk this pathway.
Yes, okay. And now you did mention that we need to find meaning in what we've suffered.
Right.
I guess that for a Catholic that would be the redemptive suffering.
That would be the idea that, yes, suffering has been exalted to a high level where I get to meet my best friend Jesus on a whole new level, and I get to redemptively suffer for others, you see. So yes, now but for others it could be, if let's say an atheist comes, it could mean it could be my suffering does have meaning because it helps me to bear the pain, and I can still bear that pain as an atheist and say I'm going to stand in this pain so I don't throw it back to the other, and that's very meaningful to anybody, you see. So bearing the pain is a psychological step that's given greater richness, I think, with the redemptive suffering idea of St. John Paul II. But see, sometimes people go down a forgiveness path and then they realize, there was more to it than I thought. And it really, I'm not going to continue down a forgiveness path because there was more to it, and maybe I wasn't treated as unjustly as I had thought. And that actually happens quite a bit. One story, for example, that I have in one of my books is that there was a mother-child situation where the mother promised the child something, and the child didn't get it because the mother had to rush the grandparent of the child to the hospital. So the child was very upset, but went on a forgiveness pathway anyway because the mother broke the promise, but then through the forgiveness process realized that, there was an extenuating circumstance. There was more to it than I realized, and so she didn't have to end up forgiving the parent, her own parent, because of the larger context. So I think Anne's challenge would be to take a look at the church and what the church represents and what the church is saying, and then to see if there is indeed a lack of fit between what she thinks is fair and what the church sees as fair.
Doctor, tell us about you had some very inspiring stories about people who've been able to forgive. Could you, in your books, could you tell us about some of them?
Well, yes, there are a lot of examples. Like here's just one. We have done a study, and when I say we, this would be Mary Hansen, Hansen, and I did a study with people in hospice. And these were all women who knew they had about 6 months to live. And they wanted to engage in the forgiveness pathway. But remember, it takes months to oftentimes go through the pathway you, Mary, and I went through in this program. Yet, given the limited physical capacity of the women, and given that they knew they had a short time, all of them went on the forgiveness journey for only 4 weeks, and all of them centered on unresolved family issues. And so what they did is they started forgiving the people in the family who had divisions with her, and they knew that they weren't going to be on the earth long, and they all ended up, and see, this is inspirational for people who might not want to have too much time with forgiving. In 4 weeks, they were able to forgive people in the family who had hurt them even 40 years ago. And what happened in these cases is we kept charting their physical development, and that kept going. But what actually was happening psychologically is their psychological well-being kept going up, including their hope for the future, which is rather interesting if you think about it. They were dying and their hope for the future was going up. And we asked them about that. about their hope for the future, and they said, I know I'm leaving the family in a better place because I have forgiven than if I had not forgiven. And so even when someone has a short time to live, they can accelerate the process, and they can then even draw people to them. And see, they had the advantage of they could draw people to them because the others knew they were going, and have a chance literally to reconcile after they had forgiven. And so I found that one a rather dramatic kind of story, because the hope for the future is going up when they're almost going to be not with us anymore, even though they were so weak physically. See, we couldn't work with them very long, and they got the job done.
Oh. And you say that these were members of their families, siblings or parents or
yes, exactly.
Whatever, children.
Yeah, it was anyone within their immediate family who they were estranged from. They weren't really interacting in any positive way, and yet they were able to forgive and affect a reconciliation in most cases. And we help them basically in a psychological sense to die well.
Are hurts from members of your family often the deepest?
They are. That's a very insightful point, Mary, because what tends to happen is we tend to feel the emotional pain after the injustice much more deeply with family members, because let's face it, they're the ones who are supposed to be good to us. It's understandable, almost as a given, that we have a right to their cooperation at least, if not their love. And so those betrayals can go very, very deeply, oftentimes much more so than might be the case, let's say, with an employer. And that's why it might take longer, you see. The struggle might be deeper because the pain is deeper, oftentimes with family.
Yeah. Now, one thing that I found very interesting in your book, 8 Keys to Forgiveness, was about students, I guess they were adolescents, who were able to, when they were helped to forgive people in their lives, the amount of bullying they did went down dramatically.
Yes, this was a study done by a woman in Korea named Jonghyo, Jonghyo Park. And she did a study with adolescents, some of whom were incarcerated actually, who had a pattern of both being bullied and bully, okay? So they had this dual pattern, which is not atypical, because if you're bullied, there's a tendency to be so angry, then you can take your anger out on others. And she worked them through the pathway of forgiveness, as you and I have discussed here today. And she found, again, there's emotional healing, but also their behavior began to change. So, in other words, you take away the motivation to bully, which is deep anger, frothing fury sometimes, and you take that away, and then you take away one of the major motivations to give pain to other people. And so I found that one a very interesting kind of a study, because she was helping, first of all, young people who might maybe resist some of this or even not understand it, but they did. And good things happened for them. So in your bringing this up, one of the points is that you can have successful forgiveness therapy with the young, the adults, middle-aged, and the elderly, and it can work.
Have you worked with prisoners, Doctor?
The prisoners is actually our most recent set of studies. We've just begun working with prisoners, and we're working in maximum security prisons, the highest level with the most serious crime, for this reason. We think, and it's a hypothesis right now, that many who are in maximum security prisons have stories to tell of injustices against them prior to their being arrested, convicted, and then imprisoned.
Right.
We want to see, we're doing a study right now at one of the maximum security prisons with 100 men, and we want to know the percentage of the men who have such stories that has happened prior to their arrest, conviction, and imprisonment. And we think it's going to be a high percentage. When I talk with people who provide services in prisons, they say it's going to be close to 100%. Then we want to put those men who have these stories of deep hurt against them through forgiveness therapy in the hope of curing their rage, if you will.
Yeah, that would be beautiful.
Yes, well, we think it's going to make the prison safer for those who get out. Some do from maximum security. We think recidivism rates will be lower because the anger fueling so much of the behavior will be ended.
Wouldn't that be beautiful?
Yes.
Set free from 2 prisons, not 1.
Yes. We're very excited about this new area for us.
Now, I was interested that the women who had, the women in the incest study were completely freed from depression.
Yes.
But the women, there was another study that you did with women who were emotionally abused.
That's right.
And they were not. I mean, they improved,
well,
I guess, significantly. Yeah. They didn't seem to achieve the same level of healing.
Well, I can't remember the details of that one, Mary, so I don't want to commit to that and say they did not, because as I recall, this one was done by Gail Reed, R-E-E-D, and they actually did have a rather dramatic decrease.
Improvement, okay.
Because, like, for example, one of the big things we were looking at there was post-traumatic stress symptoms. They call it, PTSD.
Yeah.
A lot of times military personnel coming home from war can suffer from post-traumatic stress. Well, the women who have been in abusive relationships oftentimes develop these set of symptoms, and it can be easy irritability, being startled easily, being afraid, not having the safe feeling, if you will. And a lot of their post-traumatic stress symptoms went down statistically significantly, as did their emotional compromises. So I'd have to go back and take a look at the depression variable in particular, but I think it did go down substantially, where it really did make a difference for them.
Okay. Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. Gail was very pleased with the outcome, as I was.
Okay. So you've had a special interest, I guess, in children in Belfast.
Yes, indeed. And that evolved in our thinking after we were doing forgiveness therapy with adults. You see, you have to think of forgiveness therapy as remediation, or making better that which is broken, if you will. That would be a definition of remediation. And then we thought, why not engage not in remediation work, but in prevention work, where we can introduce children early in their life to what forgiveness is and what it's not, as we've gone through in this program, have them in a gentle, developmentally appropriate way see what the pathway of forgiveness is, and we do that through stories, such as Horton Hears a Who by Dr. Seuss, where he keeps saying, a person is a person, no matter how small, as he protects a little village called the Who's. And then, of course, the jungle animals are mean to Horton, but he's gentle and kind and therefore forgiving with them. And so we started with first graders, that would be primary 3 in Belfast. And we chose Belfast deliberately because we went in 2002, and the Good Friday Peace Accord was signed only as early as 1998, okay? So there was only 4 years since the signing of the Peace Accord, and there was still high tension there, and the United Kingdom soldiers were still on street corners and the like when we got in there. And so we've been working with up to like 18 schools, and this is our 14th year, as you had said in the introduction. And the teachers do the teaching, and it's only about a half hour to an hour a week for about 15 weeks where they show forgiveness through stories and talk about forgiveness. And they talk about forgiveness on the playground or in the lunchroom, or if there's discipline to be dealt with in the classroom. They don't just deal with justice and punishment, which is so typical in schools, but also adding this layer of mercy. And what can we now do to see the worth in the other person? And when we do our science on this, comparing classrooms with forgiveness education versus not, anger goes down in the children. And see, anger in war-torn areas is typical even for someone as young as 6 years old. The children we have assessed who are as young as 6 in school,
because of the stress of everyday life, the fear,
their
of
anger
being hurt.
level is, it's close to what we call the clinical level, where if a psychologist looked at their profile, they'd be concerned. And forgiveness education, not done by psychiatrists, not done by psychologists, done by regular classroom teachers, reduces level below the clinical level, a safer level. And then cooperation increases, as you can imagine.
Right.
And
just Mary, we've reached the end. We're reaching the end, Mary.
Yes, I know. So, which helps them as well as, it's good for them. I mean, if nothing else.
Right.
But, okay, so for those who are listening, anyone who wants to pursue a path to forgiveness, you might want to look at Dr. Enright's book, Forgiveness is a Choice, or 8 Keys to Forgiveness. He also has a website for his institute, internationalforgiveness.com. Doctor, do you refer people to therapists?
We do refer, especially therapists who have taken a course of ours, which we have on internationalforgiveness.com.
Right. So you can look for that at the Institute also.
Yes. And I also wanted to mention for your listeners, if they go to that internationalforgiveness.com, we're having a forgiveness conference in Jerusalem, July 12th and 13th of this year. They might want to take a look at that.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us today, Doctor. You've been listening to Rivers of Living Water with Mary Schwartz, a show about how to grow in holiness, and we hope you've enjoyed your time with us today. Thank you.
And may the Lord bless each and every one of us. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.